My wife's family insulted me in their native language for 4 years. Little did they know I understood every word. I, 32M, met my wife 6 years ago at a tech conference in Chicago. We hit it off immediately. Both of us were software engineers with similar interests and values. She was brilliant, beautiful, and had this infectious laugh that made everyone around her smile. What I didn't realize at the time was that meeting her family would become one of the most challenging and ultimately revealing experiences of my life. My wife's family immigrated from Vietnam about 20 years ago. They're a close-knit group: parents, 2 sisters, a brother, and various aunts, uncles, and cousins who all live within a 30-minute drive of each other. When I first met them, I was nervous but excited. I'd heard so many wonderful stories about their family traditions, their cooking, and their values. The first dinner was uncomfortable. Her parents were polite but reserved. Her siblings were a bit warmer, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. What caught me off guard was when her mother said something in Vietnamese, and suddenly the entire family switched languages. For the rest of the evening, they spoke almost exclusively in Vietnamese while I sat there with a strained smile, occasionally getting brief translations from my then-girlfriend. On the drive home, I asked her about it. "They're just more comfortable in Vietnamese," she explained. "They switch back and forth all the time. It's not personal." But it felt personal, especially when it continued happening every single time I was around them. Here's what my wife didn't know. I had lived in Vietnam for 2 years after college, working with a tech startup in Ho Chi Minh City. I wasn't just familiar with Vietnamese, I was fluent. I could understand every word, every nuance, every joke. I just couldn't bring myself to tell her because, honestly, I wanted to know what her family truly thought of me. That first year, I heard it all. Her mother worried I wouldn't understand their culture. Her father questioned my long-term intentions. Her brother wondered if I was just experimenting with dating someone from a different background. Her younger sister openly speculated about how our potential children would look and whether they would connect with their heritage. All of this happened right in front of me, while I nodded and smiled, pretending I couldn't understand a word. Why didn't I speak up? Initially, it was curiosity. Then, it became a test. Would they eventually warm up to me on their own? Later, it evolved into something else entirely: strategic patience. I wanted to understand the family dynamics before revealing my hand. Plus, the longer it went on, the harder it became to explain why I had kept this secret. The most painful moments were when they'd deliberately speak Vietnamese to exclude me from important conversations. Family planning discussions? Switch to Vietnamese. Financial decisions? Vietnamese. Whenever anything meaningful came up, I was linguistically shown the door without actually being asked to leave the room. My wife tried to include me, often asking them to speak English, but it rarely lasted more than a few minutes before they'd unconsciously slip back. Sometimes, I suspected it wasn't so unconscious. "They need time," my wife would assure me. "They're still adjusting to the idea of me marrying someone outside our culture." We got married after 2 years of dating. The wedding was beautiful but stressful, with 2 very different cultural expectations colliding. Throughout the planning, I bit my tongue as her mother complained in Vietnamese about everything from the venue to my family's traditions. My mother-in-law would smile to my face in English, then turn to my wife and criticize in Vietnamese. "Your American boy has no concept of respect for elders," she once said while I was literally helping her carry groceries into her house. This is what happens when you marry outside. After our wedding, things somehow got worse. Family gatherings became a minefield of Vietnamese commentary about our life choices, my career, and whether my wife was losing her culture by being with me. Her cousins would openly discuss my appearance as if I were an exotic specimen in a museum. Her aunts would ask my wife, in Vietnamese, intensely personal questions about our relationship and future plans. All while I sat there, understanding every word but unable to respond. The turning point came during a Lunar New Year celebration at her parents' house. It had been 4 years of this dynamic. 4 years of pretending, of biting my tongue, of watching my wife trying to balance between 2 worlds. That night, her father had too much to drink and began a lengthy monologue in Vietnamese about his disappointment that his daughter had married someone who would never truly understand their family. "He sits here year after year, eating our food, participating in our traditions, but he'll always be an outsider. He doesn't even care enough to learn basic Vietnamese phrases," he said, while I was sitting 5 feet away. My mother-in-law agreed, adding, "At least he's well-behaved, unlike those other American boys. But it's a shame he'll never really be part of the family." My wife looked uncomfortable but didn't translate, instead trying to change the subject. I watched her struggling to defend me without revealing how hurtful they were being, and something in me finally snapped. I carefully set down my chopsticks, took a deep breath, and responded in perfect Vietnamese. I understand you're concerned about your daughter's happiness, but I've spent the last 4 years listening to you judge me without knowing me. I think it's time we had an honest conversation." The table went silent. My wife's jaw literally dropped. Her brother choked on his drink. Her father turned pale, then red, then a concerning shade of purple. "You speak Vietnamese?" my mother-in-law finally managed to ask, also in Vietnamese. "Fluently," I replied. "I lived in Ho Chi Minh City for 2 years after college. I've understood everything you've said since the day we met." My wife stared at me in shock. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked in English, her voice a mixture of amazement and betrayal. I answered honestly, switching back to English out of respect for her feelings. At first, I was curious. Then I kept hoping they'd accept me on their own. Eventually, it had gone on too long, and I didn't know how to bring it up without making things worse. The revelation caused immediate chaos. Her father stormed out of the room. Her mother burst into tears, mortified by all the things I'd heard over the years. Her siblings didn't know whether to laugh or apologize. My wife was caught in the middle, processing this new information about her husband while watching her family implode. She and I had an intense conversation on the drive home. She felt betrayed that I had kept such a significant secret, especially one that affected her family relationships. I explained my reasoning, but acknowledged that it had spiraled out of control. "I should have told you from the beginning," I admitted. "But I never expected it to go on for 4 years. I kept thinking they'd eventually switch to English, or that you'd put your foot down more firmly. When neither happened, I was in too deep." The aftermath was complicated. My wife was angry with me for the deception, but also angry with her family for their behavior. Her parents were humiliated and initially refused to speak to either of us. Her siblings were divided. Her brother thought it was hilarious, while her sisters thought I had deliberately embarrassed the family. For about 2 months, we existed in this painful limbo. My wife and I attended marriage counseling to work through the trust issues my deception had raised. Slowly, we rebuilt our foundation, this time with complete honesty. The real surprise came when my father-in-law reached out and asked to meet me for coffee, just the two of us. I agreed, unsure what to expect. When we sat down, he spoke in Vietnamese, this time knowing I understood every word. "I behaved poorly for 4 years. My concerns about you were never about who you are as a person, but about my fear of losing my daughter to a different culture. I was wrong to judge you without knowing you, and I was wrong to make you feel unwelcome." I responded in kind. I should have been honest from the start. Keeping my ability to understand Vietnamese a secret was disrespectful, regardless of my reasons. We talked for 3 hours that day, truly communicating for the first time. He told me stories about fleeing Vietnam, about the struggles of building a new life in America, about his fears that his children would lose their connection to their heritage. I shared stories of my time in Vietnam, my respect for the culture, and my commitment to making sure our family honored both of our backgrounds. That conversation began a slow healing process. My mother-in-law took longer to come around, deeply embarrassed by things she had said over the years. My wife's siblings adjusted more quickly, especially once they realized they could now communicate with me directly in either language. My wife and I had many difficult conversations about trust, honesty, and cultural respect. We established new boundaries with her family and new commitments to each other. The most important was a promise of radical honesty, no matter how uncomfortable. It's been 2 years since that Lunar New Year revelation. Family gatherings now feature a mix of English and Vietnamese, with everyone making efforts to include whoever is present. My relationship with my in-laws isn't perfect, but it's authentic in a way it never was before. My father-in-law and I have developed an unexpected friendship. He's been teaching me to make traditional Vietnamese dishes, correcting my pronunciation of certain words, and sharing family stories that had never been translated into English. My mother-in-law still sometimes speaks Vietnamese when she's emotional, but now she doesn't mind that I understand and often seeks my perspective. Last month, we announced that we're expecting our first child. At the celebration dinner, my mother-in-law raised her glass and said in English, "To our growing family, where all languages and all cultures are welcome." Then she added in Vietnamese, with a knowing look at me, "And to honest conversations, no matter how late they come." My wife squeezed my hand under the table. The secret that had once divided us had ultimately forced a level of honesty that brought us closer together, not just me and my wife, but our entire blended family. Looking back, I still don't know if I made the right choice in keeping my Vietnamese fluency secret for so long. What I do know is that the truth eventually created a path to genuine understanding, even if that path was messier than it needed to be. When you marry someone, you marry their family too. Sometimes the journey to becoming truly part of that family requires unexpected detours, painful confrontations, and the courage to be completely honest, even when that honesty might temporarily break what you're trying to build.